Good evening. The MacArthur Foundation has recently discovered and acknowledged the genius of Saidiya Hartman. Those of us who know and read her have long known this. We have known that she is one of the most extraordinary thinkers, compelling writers, and influential intellectual figures of our generation. From her first book, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, published in 1997, she announced herself as a major thinker and theorist. To this reputation, her second book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, published in 2008, notified us that she was a gifted writer as well. And now, with the publication of the breathtaking Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, she has solidified her place in the landscape of contemporary literature. A work of cultural history that is also a work of art, Wayward is a beautiful book that, like its author, is beyond category. It transforms the way we think as we read. Its subjects, young Black women reaching for freedom, are beyond convention. As I've written of another generation of young Black women in Harlem, Saidiya's girls are just too. They are insistent. They explode beyond the boundaries. They step outside the lines. They take more from life than it tells them they dare have, and they dismiss proper behavior and respectability. In telling their stories, Saidiya frees our imagination and invites us to conceive of another way of understanding and thinking about the past, and encourages us to create alternative, freer futures. What a treasure. What a gift. Saidiya Hartman.
Thank you. It's great to be here this evening. Of course, after that beautiful introduction, I feel I can just go home. But so I'll share a story about one of those young women. It's from a chapter in the book entitled An Intimate History of Slavery and Freedom. Now, it was Maddie's chance. Traveling alone on the Old Dominion steamer from Virginia to New York was her first adventure. It seemed as if she had been waiting forever when her mother sent for her, although it had been only a year. Not until the ship was well beyond the James River could she really believe she was on her way. She had taken the smaller auxiliary from Hampton Roads to Norfolk, and at last she was heading north. Deep gulps of the salt air calmed the lurching, hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. In 19 hours, she would arrive at the West Side Docks, Pier 26, North River, at the foot of Beach Street. Pier 26 echoed in her head like a refrain, like a rhythm competing with the crest and fall of the Atlantic, with the hiss and spit of the mammoth steam engine. It encouraged the reverie that engulfed Maddie the entire length of the journey and punctuated the list of things she was glad to say goodbye to. The oyster factory and the tobacco fields and the laundry basket spilling over with soiled linens and dirty clothes. All the places that had once been filled with her father's stories and lies and laughter were bereft, haunted after Earl Nelson's death. There were the things she would miss, the big porch of their house in Hampton, the smell of rose and crocus. What else? The people. She would miss Nana and her younger brother Mose. All the rest had been erased by anticipation and desire. She didn't shout from the deck, "Damn you, Virginia," but she was sure glad to be leaving. Until this very moment, her life had been restricted to a radius of 62 miles, which encompassed the home house and the farm in Gloucester, the one-room schoolhouse and the small church that her family had attended, and their house in town. She hoped 294 nautical miles was sufficient distance to create a new life. Maddie wanted something else. It was as simple and elusive, as vague and insistent as that. Something else was never listed as one of the reasons people left home. Only the appalling and the verifiable, the boll weevil, lynching, the white mob, the chain gang, rape, servitude, debt peonage. Yet the inchoate, what you wanted but couldn't name, the resolute, stubborn desire for an elsewhere and an otherwise that had yet to emerge clearly, a notion of the possible whose outlines were fuzzy and amorphous, exerted a force no less powerful and tenacious. Why else pick up and head off to a place where you were a stranger, tolerated at best, but most often unwanted and reviled? The wide open of the Atlantic made plain the restricted and dwarfed life Maddie was rushing away from, a life where her only possibilities were the same ones that had been imposed on her grandmother and mother. She too had been sentenced to servile labor, not trained for it or drawn to it. The house was no better than the fields. Domestic work was as merciless and unsparing as shucking oysters and harvesting tobacco. The stench of fish, or hands sticky and yellow from nicotine, the headaches and the nausea, or the unwanted touch, the pressing and grabbing under her dress. Submit or risk a beating, ass, hands, and capacities owned by mistress and sir. Why pretend there was an opportunity to be found inside the house of white folks, or lie about its dangers? Who didn't hate domestic work? No colored woman would ever forget that it carried the taint of slavery. No need to pretend about its dangers. Everyone knew of a girl fired and sent away before she was too big with belly. The kitchen was the field and the brothel. No need to sugarcoat the fact. Black women were still in the house of bondage. Neither Maddie nor her mother or grandmother had chosen the kitchen or the wash tub. They had been conscripted there. Aboard a steamer plowing the waters of the eastern seaboard, Maddie was steadfast in the belief that moving on was the only way to make a better life, and flight the precursor to freedom. Along with most of the colored passengers, Maddie was consigned to steerage, which they shared with dogs, goats, and chickens. But even the humiliation of the animals and the 2 dirty bathrooms reserved for them and the rope separating them from the rest of the deck could be suffered because she imagined that New York City promised a release from the color line and believed willfully and blindly that everything terrible was behind her now, as did the hundreds of other Negroes crowded around her, eager to disembark. She knew nothing of the riots that erupted in 1900 and 1905, but in 1915, she would experience the threat and the danger firsthand. Her head was full of dreams. It was 1913, and anything seemed possible. She had done the one thing which seemed to offer hope. She had left home. She was one of the thousands of young Black folks rushing to New York from Virginia and elsewhere. Only later would these acts of flight be recognized as a general strike against slavery in its new guises, as a fugitive movement from life lived under the heel of white men. When Maddie Nelson landed at Pier 26, she was dreamy with thoughts of what the future would hold. In the crush of folks on the pier, she breathed comfortably inside her own skin, enjoying the self-forgetfulness that she had imagined was possible in a free territory. It was still too early for the whores, sissies, and toughs who plied their trade at the docks. Families gathered, awaiting daughters and brothers and cousins, Thugs and gangsters lurked at the outskirts of the crowd, on the lookout for naive young women in search of direction or in need of help with a heavy piece of luggage. When Maddie Nelson arrived in New York City, she was barely a woman at 15. She was a tall, thin, dark-skinned girl, the kind only a father would have ever described as lovely, and the kind white people labeled a negress to make apparent their contempt and scorn. It would be a decade before the thick hair, tamed in braids and pinned in a bun on the top of her head, prominent cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and wide, full lips would be compared to the beauty of an African mask. Even when dressed in her Sunday best, Maddie was decidedly unsophisticated. Yet despite the not quite polished picture the black but comely small-town girl presented, Maddie was determined to be more than nothing. It was hard for Maddie to make a distinction between the city and freedom itself. Like those provincials and fools whom Paul Laurence Dunbar derided in The Sport of the Gods as intoxicated by the subtle and insidious wine of the streets, who translated the Bowery into romance, made Broadway into lyric, and Central Park into a pastoral, and thereby failed to read the city as it really was, or apprehend it in a mode commensurate with its danger, or properly adjust to its rhythms and demands. Maddie, looking past the cold facts and the risk, mistook the city for a place where she might thrive. The real fever of love would take hold of her, and the streets and the dance halls did become her best friends. All the sentimental causes for this rush and flight, the freedom to move, the want of liberty, the hunger for more and better, and the need of breathing room explained her presence in New York. She too would fall prey to the pleasures and dangers of the city while trying to make a feast of its meager opportunities. None of the factories, shops, or offices would hire colored girls, especially girls as dark as Maddie. Housework and laundry were her only options. It is hard to say whether it was the disappointment at the lack of opportunity or the assault of the coldest winter she had ever experienced that landed her in bed, sick for more than a month, only a few weeks after she had arrived. When Maddie recovered her strength, she found a position as a domestic at a boarding house with 23 rooms where she was the sole maid. Washing, cleaning rooms, making beds, and trudging up and down the 5 flights of stairs in the boarding house wore her out. She hated the drudgery and boredom, but her mother said if she wasn't going to school, she had to work. Most nights she fell into bed exhausted, too tired to think about going to the moving pictures or the dance hall. When she wasn't tired, she was lonely. The evenings were long and dull and not at all as she had imagined New York. After 5 weeks, she quit the boarding house and found a new job at a Chinese laundry in Bayonne, New Jersey, which was different but not better. The days were still long and exhausting, but now spent doubled over pressing clothes. Few white girls were willing to work for the Chinese. The sexual panic about the dangers of Chinese men reached a new height after the body of a young white woman was found in the trunk of a Chinatown bachelor. The daily papers fed the hysteria and fueled the idea of the yellow peril by regularly reporting stories of unsuspecting girls lured into opium dens and turned into drug-addled mistresses or seduced by lonely bachelors at taxi dance halls or murdered by their lovers. For Maddie, the Chinese laundry was just another job, a way station until something better became available. Herman Hawkins was her first friend in New York. He worked as a waiter in a boarding house not far from where she lived with her mother. At 25 years old, he appeared worldly to the not yet 16-year-old Maddie, who by her own admission knew nothing at all but was eager to learn. Herman boasted that he would show her everything, the Tenderloin, Harlem, Coney Island. He was a recent migrant from Georgia, so no doubt he enjoyed showing Maddie his city. Maddie looked forward to the evening spent with her gentleman friend. They would go to dance halls and parties where couples did the slow drag, funky butt, and fishtail, charags played on player pianos, and the ditties and love and trouble songs the white world derisively called coon songs. One night after such a party, they were walking home through Allen Park when Herman started talking about the things he wanted to do to her. Maddie did not know if he started talking this way because of how they had been dancing when the lights were dimmed, wrapped up so tight in each other that the boundary between her body and his gave way to flesh, or if the seclusion of the park in the early hours after midnight encouraged him to speak to her like she was a woman, like she was his woman, like she was the kind of woman who enjoyed listening to that kind of talk. In hot pursuit of the virginal but curious Maddie, Herman described in explicit detail what a body could do and how it would make her feel. Maddie had never done any of those things before, and she tried to picture the intimate acts he described and the sensations aroused by such acts, and wondered if she would be embarrassed with her bloomers down around her ankles, and what his body would feel like on top of hers, and if the bed sheets would be clean, or if the cot would squeak when they made love, like her mother's bed when she and Mr. Smith were going at it. It wasn't right for Herman Hawkins to say such things. He had never spoken to her like this before. No one had. Maddie told him to stop, and yet he continued to talk, and she continued to listen. She knew what he was saying was bad, but it also sounded thrilling. He kept on talking as if she had not asked him to stop, and instead of getting angry or upset, she just listened. Maddie was not aware that she was giving him an answer to his question, and that she had said yes. Shortly after that walk in Allen Park, he convinced Maddie to remove her camisole and bloomers. It is not difficult to imagine the things Herman Hawkins taught Maddie inside the rented room of a lodging house. There were so many lessons to teach a girl who knew nothing, so much for her to discover: what to do, how to hold him, how not to be embarrassed by her naked body or ashamed of her smells and the things she wanted to do. First, she had to breathe deeply and let go of the body armored in anticipation of insult and attack, surrender in consequence of pleasure, allow the body to yield to another, to be entered, joined, and bridged, to risk all defense, yet not be made into the mule of the world. If a tender lover, he might have lingered kissing her mouth, traced the length of her back with his tongue, discovered the ways she liked to be held and the best ways to make her come. Had he been a selfish and demanding one, he would have trained her for his pleasure, instructing her how to move, what to say, when to keep her mouth shut. Did he force her to repeat words that humiliated and excited her, or plead with her to admit what she wanted most but feared? Or perhaps they spoke no words at all, just hands fondling genitals, tongues thrust into ears, fingers exploring every orifice. Were they loud? Did they even care if the lodgers next door or the spying neighbors downstairs heard them? Would they have minded if a lonely bachelor caught a glimpse of flesh, or an abandoned wife savored the moans escaping through the open window and made them her own? Or were they quiet and intent on denying others their sound? Did the men hanging on the corner wink at Maddie as she made her way home, or the women exchange knowing and hungry glances? Maddie had no other person to compare him with, no scale to weigh his respective merits and weaknesses, talents and areas in need of improvement. Perhaps his skills were little more than the accumulated lessons he had acquired from the women he had been with, women his age and older, women capable of training and directing him, women unafraid to tell him to hush and get to it, women who expected little else of him because they also worked hard for meager wages and realized that although 25, like most colored men in New York, he couldn't afford to marry or support a family, even if he wanted one. Had the boast of other men prodded him to lie, as they did, about what he could do or had done, and to be as adamant about what he would never do? That is, the kind of habits one indulged occasionally, but never disclose. Perhaps what mattered most to Maddie was that she had found the way to her own pleasure, had learned to enjoy the smell of herself on her hands and in his hair, found a way to lessen the boredom and diminish the hours spent waiting and trying to find a way out. Whether her lover valued her as a prize or took advantage of a gullible young woman matters less than what Maddie discovered in that room. What she wanted might actually matter, or that I want that becomes a way to cleanse the stench of ain't got, can't get, don't. It is possible that Maddie experienced this opening of her desire as a refusal of all that kept her fixed in place, stuck at the laundry, chained to an ironing board, suffocating and without any possibility of change. An unremarkable act of coitus, a deed of no import except to those involved, a routine practice not in any way to be confused with matters of significance. Just an everyday act of fucking, a quasi-event, would not have been much notice had it not been a part of a greater social upheaval. Intimate acts shared in rented rooms, in boarding houses and tenements throughout the city fueled the social panic about wandering, dissolute young women and the great numbers of young Black people rushing to New York. Maddie's restiveness and longing and the free love practiced in a private bedroom rented by the week were part of a larger ensemble of intimate acts that were transforming social life and inaugurating the modern, which was characterized by the entrenchment and transformation of racism, emergent forms of dispossession, and the design of new enclosures, and by a fierce and expanded sense of what might be possible. Girls on the cusp of womanhood, young colored women like Maddie, were at the center of this revolution in a minor key. Despite the efforts of the state to contain it as pathology and as crime, it proved impossible to stave the tide of desires not bound by law, coupling and procreation outside the embrace of marriage, and the ardent longing to live as one wanted. A small rented room was a laboratory for trying to live free in a world where freedom was thwarted, elusive, deferred, anticipated rather than actualized. Maddie was a hunger artist, wasting away before the eyes of the world for lack of opportunity while everyone gawked and watched. And like any artist with no art form, she became dangerous. Maddie was desperate not to be a servant or drudge, but there was no ready blueprint for another life that she could follow besides the one she crafted. An inchoate plan and radical thought and deed were her resources. If she could feel deeply, she could be free. She knew that beauty was not a luxury, but like food and water, a requirement for living. She loved cashmere sweaters, not because they were expensive, but because the fabric felt so exquisite against her skin, like 1,000 fingers caressing her arms, and the cool slip of silk undergarments against her flesh, smooth and releasing all that heat and fire, and the way a gold bracelet glinted and flashed in the sunlight and made the tone of her blue-black flesh so lush, as if right below the skin there were layers of indigo and ochre, a vortex of deep black in which you could lose yourself. Beauty and longing provided the essential architecture of her existence. Her genius was exhausted in trying to live. What took place behind the closed doors of a rented room in a lodging house was a moment, an iteration of the revolution of Black intimate life that was taking place in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago in the first decades of the 20th century. It was part of the general unrest that came to define the age and the new Negro. Experiment was everywhere. It was a ubiquitous term employed to describe a range of social projects, from the settlement house to a laboratory of sociology to a model tenement, from aesthetic and scientific innovations to radical designs for living. It was a term bandied about. There was nothing precious or unusual about seeking, venturing, testing, trying, speculating, discovering, exploring new avenues, breaking with tradition, defying law, and making it, except that hardly anyone imagined that young Black women might be involved in this project too. Few guessed that Maddie was trying to make something of herself, however uncertain she was about what might be, and however desperate to shake loose the expectations and demands of others, which always boil down to drudge and whore. Better an errant path than the known whirl, better loose than stuck. If it is possible to imagine Maddie and other young Black women as innovators and radical thinkers, then the transformation of sexuality, intimacy, affiliation, and kinship taking place in the Black quarters of northern cities might be labeled the revolution before Gatsby, before the queer men and lady lovers and pansies congregated at the Ubangi Club or the Garden of Joy or the Clam House, before the Harlem Renaissance, before white folks journeyed uptown to get a taste of the other, before F. Scott Fitzgerald and Radcliffe Hall and Henry Miller, before Black communists and socialists preaching on Harlem streets noticed girls like Maddie, eager as any to hear news of a future world. This reconstruction of intimate life commenced. After the slave ship and the plantation, the third revolution of Black intimate life unfolded in the city. The hallway, bedroom, stoop, rooftop, air shaft, and kitchenette provided the space of experiment. The tenement and the rooming house furnished the social laboratory of the Black working class and the poor. The bedroom was a domain of thought and deed, and a site for enacting, exceeding, undoing, and remaking relations of power. Unfortunately, the police and the sociologists were there also, ready and waiting for Maddie Nelson on the threshold of want. Thank you.
Thank you. It was late on a dreary morning when I went to pick up the author. I had driven up a winding road through the remains of a defunct military base that had been built on land that belonged for thousands of years to the coastal Miwok people. The summer fog was thick, the buildings funereal. I could not see well, and I wondered if I had lost my way. And then, suddenly, she was there. Here I want to make a record scratch noise. I really did meet Carmen at the Headland Center for the Arts on a foggy day in Marin County. This was a few months before Grey Wolf published Her Body and Other Parties, and shortly after we had acquired what would become her new memoir, In the Dream House. It's hard to write about Carmen Maria Machado without resorting to the Gothic. Her short stories are haunted, sometimes by literal ghosts, but also by trauma, by things that don't want to be explained or that haven't yet been articulated. Characters in her fiction find themselves at risk in the very places that should give them comfort. The women in them open doors that most people would back away from. That fearlessness is a quality that Carmen brings to her writing. It comes from her desire to explore the messiest and darkest corners of our lives, from her pressing need to tell stories that haven't always been told, and to find just the right form in which to tell them. Acquiring fiction as an editor is really pretty easy. You might spend months fretting that you haven't read anything that you want to publish, but then the bell rings, as Gertrude Stein put it, and you jump. Good writing announces itself. When I first read the manuscript that became Her Body and Other Parties, it didn't take many pages for me to know that I was in the presence of an extraordinary and unusual talent. I was struck by the way Carmen yokes raw energy to a very high level of craft and a startlingly original imagination. In that collection, she draws on horror, erotica, fantasy, the Gothic, speculative fiction, and the rich tradition of the short story, mashes it all up with postmodern hijinks to make for a book that is at once formally ambitious and just pure fun. What sets her apart from literary writers who grafted their boyhood interest, and it has so often been boys, in genre fiction onto literary fiction, is that Machado has actually also been active in a community of genre writers. She's a graduate of both the Iowa Writers' Workshop and the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers' Workshop, a 6-week workshop in San Diego where she studied with the cult sci-fi writer Ted Chiang. Her stories can remarkably satisfy both audiences. I once called her bilingual when it comes to genre, though Carmen has long argued, and I think accurately, that this distinction is beyond meaningless. Good writing is good writing, after all. I was relieved at the time when I met her that the collection made no pretense to being linked, a quasi-novel. It most definitely did make a unified focus statement about the reality of women's lives and the violence that has been visited upon their bodies. We published the book just as the Me Too movement was gathering its tidal force. That might have seemed fortuitous, but it wasn't really a complete coincidence. Like all great artists, Carmen simply had her antennae up, ready to receive the vibrations that were latent in the culture. The book became a National Book Award finalist and was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, and the Bard Fiction Prize, among countless other honors. The collection's warm embrace by reviewers, readers, and prize committees alike rocketed Carmen into the front rank of writers of her generation. The New York Times listed Her Body and Other Parties as a member of, quote, the New Vanguard, one of 15 remarkable books by women that are shaping the way we read and write fiction in the 21st century. In the author questionnaire that Carmen filled out as we were preparing to launch her memoir in the Dream House, she told us that, I am of the firm belief that all fiction is political, and mine is certainly no exception. I react strongly to the things I think are missing from narratives, women's voices, especially queer women and fat women and neurotic women who are also self-possessed, examinations of women's bodies without the male gaze, explicit discussions of sex from a woman's perspective. That need to fill an absence guided the writing of her new book, which is very much a part of a tradition of literature of witness. In the Dreamhouse describes what it means to be a victim of to be a victim in an abusive queer relationship, a relationship that I realized may have cropped up in a buried way in a few of the stories in Her Body and Other Parties. Carmen wrestled for years with how to talk and write about her experience, but the book is no mere account. The innovative structure she found for it perfectly reflects her struggle to tell the story to herself. It is, in a way, like a Rashomon of the self, as she looks at the facts from different angles. The book is made up of short sections with titles that all begin with Dreamhouse as. Dreamhouse is picaresque, Dreamhouse is world building, Dreamhouse is queer villainy, Dreamhouse is Bluebeard, Dreamhouse is Chekhov's gun, all invoking a series of narrative tropes as a way to seek an adequate vehicle to convey her harrowing experience. For all the darkness and difficulty of this book, it's made bearable by Carmen's inventiveness, wit, and formal play. The events are relayed largely chronologically, from flirting and dating through the torrid and frankly described sex to the fraught and eventually violent long-distance relationship to the eventual breakup. But the book is threaded with flashbacks to Carmen's childhood and essayistic critical digressions that bring air and energy into what, in less inventive and talented hands, might have been a claustrophobic portrayal of a relationship gone bad. Amidst the steadily growing horror, Carmen somehow makes you feel by turns bemused, sympathetic, intrigued, and completely always gripped. The result is an honest, challenging, emotionally wrenching, intellectually satisfying, and really singular reading experience. The book fills a substantial gap on the bookshelf for people who don't often find themselves portrayed in books. And it's the rare work that has the potential to be of help and solace to many people, while simultaneously seeming to reinvent an entire genre. Unflinching in her urgent examination of gender, sexuality, and body politics, and already so accomplished in both fiction and nonfiction, she represents the way forward for a new generation of readers and writers. So let me bring you back into that place of instability and confusion, the fog. Luckily, you have an able driver to take you through it and bring you out from it, to somewhere entirely inspiring and new. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Carmen Maria Machado.
Hello. Wow, those lights are extremely bright. Hi, everyone. So Ethan did such a lovely job explaining the premise of the book, which is how I've been starting to discuss it because the structure is so unusual. But I think all I need to tell you before I jump in reading is that I'm just going to kind of go through an assortment of these little chapters. Part of the book is in second person. I promise you it's on purpose. Don't ask me why I have to say that. I think that's it. So I will begin. Dream house as luck of the draw. Part of the problem was, as a weird fat girl, you felt lucky. She did what you'd wished a million others had done, looked past arbitrary markers of social currency and seen your brains and ferocious talent and quick wit and pugnacious approach to assholes. When you started writing about fatness a long time ago in your live journal, who here was on live journal? I miss it every day. A commenter said to you that you were pretty and smart and charming, but as long as you were fat, you'd never have your choice of lovers. You remember feeling outrage and then processing the reality, the practicality of what he'd said. You were so angry at the world. You wondered when she came along if this was what most people got to experience in their lives, a straight line from want to satisfaction, desire manifested and satisfied in reasonable succession. This had never been the case before. It had always been fraught. How many times had you said, if I just looked a little different, I'd be drowning in love. Now you got to drown without needing to change a single cell. Lucky you. Dreamhouse as Bluebeard. Bluebeard's greatest lie was that there was only one rule. The newest wife could do anything she wanted, anything, as long as she didn't do that single arbitrary thing, didn't stick that tiny inconsequential key into that tiny inconsequential lock. But we all know that was just the beginning, a test. She failed and lived to tell the tale, as I have. But even if she'd passed, even if she'd listened, there would have been some other request, a little larger, a little stranger, and if she'd kept going, kept allowing herself to be trained like a corset fanatic, pinching her waist smaller and smaller, there'd have been a scene where Bluebeard danced around with the rotting corpses of his past wives clasped in his arms, and the newest wife would have sat there mutely, suppressing growing horror, swallowing the egg of vomit that bobbed behind her breastbone. And then later, another scene in which he did unspeakable things to the bodies, women, they'd once been women, and she just stared dead into the middle distance, seeking some mute purgatory where she could live forever. Some scholars believe that Bluebeard's Bluebeard is a symbol of his supernatural nature, easier to accept than being brought to heel by a simple man. But isn't that the joke? He can be simple, and he doesn't have to be a man. Because she hadn't blinked at the key and its conditions, hadn't paused when he told her that her footfalls were too heavy for his liking, hadn't protested when he fucked her while she wept, hadn't declined when he suggested she stop speaking, hadn't said a word when he left bruises on her arms, hadn't scolded him for speaking to her like she was a dog or a child, hadn't run screaming down the path from the castle into the nearest village, pleading with someone to help, help, help. It made logical sense that she sat there and watched him spinning around the body of wife number 4, its decaying head flopping backward on a hinge of flesh. This is how you are toughened, the newest wife reasoned. This is where the tenacity of love is practiced, its tensile strength, its durability. You are being tested, and you are passing the test. Sweet girl, sweet self, look how good you are, look how loyal, look how loved. Dream house as idiom. I always thought the expression safe as houses meant that houses were safe places. It's a beautiful idea, like running home with a late summer thunderstorm huffing down your neck. There's the house waiting for you, a barrier from nature, from scrutiny, from other people. Standing on the other side of the glass, watching the sky playfully pummel the earth like a sibling. But house idioms and their variants often signify the opposite of safety and security. If something is a house of cards, it is precarious, easily disrupted. If the writing is on the wall, we can see the end of something long before it arrives. If we do not throw stones in glass houses, it is because the house is constructed of hypocrisy, readily shattered. All expressions of weakness, of the inevitability of failure. Safe as houses is something closer to the house always wins. Instead of a shared structure providing shelter, it means the person in charge is secure and everyone else should be afraid. Dream house as appetite. You make a mistake early on, though you don't know it at the time. You admit to her that you are constantly nursing low-grade crushes on many people in your life. Nothing acted on, just that you find many people attractive and do your best to surround yourself with smart and funny minds, and the result is a gooey, lovely space somewhere between philia and eros. You've been this way as long as you can remember. You've always found this quirk of your personality to be just that, a quirk, and she laughs and says she's charmed by it. Over the course of your relationship, she will accuse you of fucking or wanting to fuck or planning to fuck the following people. Your roommate, your roommate's girlfriend, dozens of your friends, the Clarion class you haven't met yet, a dozen of her friends, not a few of her colleagues at Indiana, her ex-girlfriend, her ex-boyfriend, your ex-boyfriends, several of your teachers, the director of your MFA program, several of your students, one of your doctors, and in perhaps the most demented moment of this exercise, her father. Also an untold litany of strangers, people on the subway and in coffee shops, waiters at restaurants, store clerks and grocery store cashiers, and librarians and ticket takers and janitors and museum goers and beach sleepers. The problem is that denial sounds like a confession to her, and so the burden of proof is forced upon you. To show that you have not been fucking those people, you become adept at doing searches on your phone, providing evidence you haven't been in contact with anyone. You stop talking about a promising student in one of your classes because she becomes fixated on the idea that you have a crush on a 19-year-old who has just learned how to balance exposition and scene. One day, as she rubs her fingers over you and you close your eyes in pleasure, she grabs your face and twists it toward her. She gets so close to you, you smell something sour on her breath. Who are you thinking about, she says. It's phrased like a question, but it isn't. Your mouth moves, but nothing comes out, and she squeezes your jaw a little harder. Look at me when I fuck you, she says. You pretend to come. Dream house as the river Leith. Later that fall, she asks you to join her at the Harvard-Yale football game. It is a favorite tradition of hers, and she has flown there for the occasion, but needs to be back in Indiana earlier than expected. If you drive there, you can bring me back, she says, and so you drive from Iowa to Connecticut to meet her. And so after a day of autumn temperatures and flask sips and people and furs and expensive bottles of champagne rolling around on the muddy ground like Budweiser cans, you sleep hard in an uncomfortable hotel bed. The next afternoon, you prepare to leave. She is a reckless driver. Nothing has changed since that trip to Savannah, and so you get behind the wheel of your car without asking. You pull away from New Haven, alternating between the radio, conversation, and silence. You scoot down through Connecticut and New York. In Pennsylvania, the light drops away early, and rain glosses the pavement. Somewhere in the middle of the endless, hilly length of this state, the one you'd grown up in, she interrupts herself mid-sentence. "Why won't you let me drive?" she asks. Her voice is controlled, measured, like a dog whose tail has gone rigid. Nothing is happening, but something is wrong. "I'm okay driving," you say. "You're tired," she says, "too tired to drive." "I'm not," you say, and you aren't. "You're too tired and you're going to kill us," she says. "You hate me. You want me to die." "I don't hate you," you say. "I don't want you to die." "You hate me," she says, her voice going up half an octave with every syllable. "You're going to kill us and you don't even care, you selfish bitch." You selfish bitch." She begins to pound the dashboard. "You selfish bitch, you selfish bitch, you selfish." You pull off at the next exit and park at a gas station. She throws open the passenger door even before the car stops moving and stalks around the parking lot like a teenage boy who is trying to cool down before he punches a wall. You sit in the driver's seat watching her pace. The urge to cry is present, but far off, like you're high. When she starts walking back toward the car, her eyes fixed on your face, you hastily unbuckle your seatbelt and run to the passenger seat. You don't want her to leave without you, and you're not sure she won't. Afterward, the drive is framed by wet, dark mountains. You remember going through Pennsylvania around Christmas the year before and seeing 18-wheelers overturned on the side of these same roads, their engine blocks blackened by extinguished fires, and cars, too, on the highway's shoulder, casually burning. She goes 80, 90 miles per hour, and you have to look away from the climbing needle. The shadowy shapes of deer pass in front of you through curtains of rain. "I am going to die," you think. You pray for a cop to pull you over, watching the side mirror for blue and red lights that never appear. You clutch the door when she accelerates and when the car whips weightlessly over a hill. "Stop that," she says, and goes even faster. "Sleep," she commands, but you cannot sleep. Midnight comes. You enter Ohio, a state you've always found very boring to drive across, but now your adrenaline makes your hands tremble in your lap. You drive past dead animals by the dozens, raccoons blasted apart by speeding tires, deer whose muscular animal bodies are contorted like that of fallen dancers. The rain slows, then stops, and you enter Indiana. In the final stretch, when she exits the main highway and takes a 2-lane country road south to Bloomington, the car begins to yawn to the left. The car begins to yawn to the left, kissing the double line, surpassing it, and then to the right, where the door passes within inches of a metal barrier. When you look over, the back of her skull is touching the headrest, her eyes closed. You bark her name, and the car rights itself. "Now you're too tired," you say. "You're falling asleep. Please let me do this final stretch. We're almost there." "I'm fine," she says. "My body is my bitch. I can make it do whatever I want." "Please pull over." She curls her lip, but doesn't say anything, and doesn't stop. Every so often, the car swerves. You pass a religious billboard that asks if you know where you'd go after death. In full daylight, this sort of manipulative propaganda would make you roll your eyes, but now it tugs on an old childhood fear, and you whimper and then try, too late, to swallow the sound. When you first came to Bloomington, when you helped her find the dream house, it was impossibly bright. It was late spring, and the trees were electric, new-growth neon green. Now the leaves burn in red and orange, and brown ones spiral away from the branches. The season is dying, and you are going to die too, you are certain, this night. The car pulls into the driveway around 4 in the morning and sits there in silence. You feel like you're going to throw up. The leaves drop onto the car's roof, and the wind snatches them away with a papery scrape. Finally, she reaches down to unbuckle her seatbelt, but you are watching the lawn. 2 dark shapes are crossing it, like dogs, but not. Coyotes. It would have been a lovely sight at any time, but in contrast to the night's terrors, it is so beautiful your face tingles. Look, you say softly, pointing. She starts, as if you've struck her. Then she sees what you see. You wait for her coo, for her sweetness. Fuck you, she says. She leans toward you and speaks directly into your ear. You say look without saying anything else. I think you're fucking pointing out someone who's gonna fucking kill us. It's the middle of the night. What the fuck is wrong with you? She kicks open the car door. The coyotes bolt for the trees. You watch her stomp through the dream house. Her silhouette is thrown up against a series of illuminated windows, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and then all the lights go out. You get out of the car and sit against the side of the house, putting your winter coat on backward like a smock. The coyotes come back after a while, trotting casually across the lawn, deer too, and foxes, all paying you no mind, as if you are part of the scenery, as if you aren't there at all. You could go to bed too. Or you could sit at the table in the kitchen and watch this scene from behind the window pane, but that, you think, would be like putting this night in the museum, too removed, too soon forgotten. Sit with this, you think. Don't forget this is happening. Tomorrow you will push this away, but here, remember. Your butt goes numb in the grass. The lawn is a theater of wildlife. Your little car, stalwart as any stallion, sits silent and bright in the driveway, finally cooling down after her long drive. Birds titter early morning Morse code from the trees. A gaggle of drunk students crests the hill at the edge of the golf course and then stands there looking at you, perhaps believing you to be a ghost, before shuffling down onto the street. And in the same way that the wrist rotates faster when the door latch is about to release, the pre-dawn night speeds up just a little before the day comes. And though it would not be until the next summer solstice that you be free from her, though you would spend the season's precipitous drop into darkness alongside her, on this morning, light seeps into the sky and you are present with your body and your mind, and you do not forget. In the morning, the woman who made you ill with fear brews a pot of coffee and jokes with you and kisses you and sweetly scratches your scalp like nothing has happened. And as though you'd slept, a new day begins again. Dreamhouse as diagnosis. Should you be concerned? You feel sick to your stomach almost constantly. The slightest motion makes you nauseated. There is a burning in your gut, cramping too, acid, probably and hopefully not cancer. You develop a tremor in your limbs, a weird closed-down sensation in your esophagus. You cry for no reason. You can't come, can't look her in the eye, can't bring yourself to go to one more bar. Your back starts to hurt, and your feet, and a doctor says to you direly that you need to lose weight. You bawl your eyes out and miss the punchline entirely. The weight you need to lose is 105 pounds and blonde, and sitting in the waiting room with an annoyed expression on her face. Dreamhouse as inventory. She makes you tell her what is wrong with you. This is a favorite activity, even better than her telling you what's wrong with you. Years later, it's a habit that's hard to break. You can be an incorrigible snob. You value intelligence and wit over other, more admirable qualities. You hate it when people say stupid things. You have an ego. You believe you are good at what you do. You're neurotic and anxious and self-centered. You get impatient when people don't understand things as quickly as you do. You've definitely done some dumb things because of horniness, embarrassing things. You've degraded yourself in front of more than one person. You secretly want to be a man, not because of doubts about your gender identity, but because you want people to take you more seriously. You love squeezing zits. You'd rather have an orgasm than do most things. feelings. Occasionally, and without warning, your ability to give a fuck drops to exactly zero, and you become useless to anyone who needs you. You've had sexual fantasies about the majority of your friends. You wish someone would call you a genius. You've cheated at board games. You once went to an emergency doctor's appointment on Christmas Day because you thought you had herpes, but it was just a pimple. As a child, you were a tattletale, and you remain an unflinching rule follower. You're a prude about drugs. You're a hypochondriac. The only way you can focus during meditation is thinking about an orgy. You love a good fight. This is called Dreamhouse's Mystical Pregnancy, and there's a footnote in here, and I'll let you know where the footnote starts. Dreamhouse's Mystical Pregnancy. Every television show you watched in your 20s included some kind of mystical pregnancy. Every interesting female character needs one, or so showrunners seem to think. Vampires get pregnant with magical mortals, comatose women give birth to gods, and empathic Starfleet officers to mystic energy. Time-traveling companions discover they've been flesh avatars for months, and their actual body is somewhere far away and about to give birth. One woman wakes up on her wedding day to discover herself massively pregnant, courtesy of an alien. You are thinking about these episodes when you begin to experience pregnancy symptoms in the dream house. You vomit into the toilet, you feel swollen and out of sorts. The two of you have talked about a child for so long that you abandon all reason and wonder if you could be pregnant. You've had so much sex, and the intensity is as real as anything. You consider saying to her, I'm sick like I'm pregnant, isn't that weird? But you are terrified of the radical body modification that is pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, the unforgiving nature of motherhood, and most importantly, what she'll accuse you of, what she'll do afterward. You drink ginger ale, you lie down for a long time, you forego food for an evening under the pretense of having snacked, which you definitely did not do. You cannot be pregnant, you cannot be pregnant, you literally absolutely could not be pregnant under any circumstances. And here's the footnote. Thompson, Motif Index of Folk Literature, Type 511 1.3, Conception from Eating Mango, T511 1.5, Conception from Eating Lemon, T511 2.1, Conception from Eating Mandrake, T511 2.2, Conception from Eating Watercress, T511 3.1, Conception from Eating Peppercorn, T511 3.2, Conception from Eating Spinach, T511 4.1, Conception from Eating Rose, T511 5.2, Conception from Swallowing a Worm in a Drink of Water, T511 5.3, Conception from Eating Louse, T511 6.1, Conception from Eating a Woman's Heart, T511 6.2, Conception from Eating Finger Bones, T511 7.1, Conception after Eating Honey Given by a Lover, T511 8.6, Conception from Swallowing a Pearl, T512.4, Conception from Drinking a Saint's Tears, T512.7, Conception from Drinking Dew, T513.1, Conception through another's wish, T514, conception after reciprocal desire for each other, T515.1, impregnation through a lustful glance, T516, conception through a dream, T517, conception from extraordinary intercourse, T521, conception from sunlight, T521.1, conception from moonlight, T521.2, conception from a rainbow, T522, conception from falling rain, T523, conception from bathing, T524, conception from wind, T525, conception from a falling star, T525.2, impregnation by comet, T528, impregnation by thunder or lightning, T532.1.3, impregnation by leaf of lettuce, T532.1.4, conception from the smell of a cooked dragon's heart, T532 1.4.1, conception after smelling ground bone dust, T532.2, conception from stepping on an animal, T532.3, conception from fruit thrown against the breast, T532.5, conception from putting on another's girdle, T532.1, conception from the hiss of a cobra, T533, conception from spittle, T534, conception from blood, T535, conception from fire, T536, conception from feathers falling on a woman, T539.2, conception by a cry. You take a pregnancy test anyway, like an idiot. And of course it's negative because you haven't had a penis anywhere near your body in years. You're afraid she'll find the test, so you put it in a Ziploc bag and throw it out in someone's trash can on the street after she's gone to class. We'll do two more. Dreamhouse as natural disaster. I get bad heartburn. It's the Zoloft, which takes the edge off my anxiety but brings along a bunch of awful side effects, like a good friend who can't shed a bad lover. Every so often, I take my nightly meds, and within a few minutes, feel like a hot poker has been shoved down my esophagus. I chew antacids and walk to the bathroom. Often the pain or the force of the neutralization makes me vomit. I become functionally everyone's favorite science fair project. When I bend over the toilet, I think a lot about how my heart is a volcano, like that quote from Khalil Gibran. It's dumb, but it moved me, and I wrote it down on a Post-it note that I stuck on my desk. If your heart is a volcano, how shall you expect flowers to bloom in your hands? It stayed there until a bad day, working on this book, when I loathed the quote with every fiber of my being and crumpled it up and threw it away. Reader, do you remember that ridiculous movie Volcano with Tommy Lee Jones? Do you remember how they stopped the eruption in the middle of downtown Los Angeles? They diverted it with cement roadblocks and pointed fire hoses at it, and then rerouted the lava to the ocean, and everything was fine? Sweet reader, that is not how lava works. Anyone can tell you that. Here is the truth. I keep waiting for my anger to go dormant, but it won't. I keep waiting for someone to reroute my anger into the ocean, but no one can. My heart is closer to Dante's Peak of Dante's Peak. My anger dissolves grandmas in acid lakes and raises Pacific Northwest towns with ash and asphyxiates jet engines with its grit. Lava keeps leaking down my slopes. You should have listened to the scientist. You should have evacuated earlier. So Khalil Gibran, I know what he's saying, but even rhetorically, he's making exactly the wrong point. The fact is, people settle near volcanoes because the resulting soil is extraordinary, dense with nutrients from the ash. In this dangerous place, their fruit is sweeter, their crops taller, their flowers more radiant, their yield more bountiful. The truth is, there is no better place to live than in the shadow of a beautiful, furious mountain. Dreamhouse as Sodom. Like Lot's wife, you looked back, and like Lot's wife, you were turned into a pillar of salt. But unlike Lot's wife, God gave you a second chance and turned you human again, but then you looked back again and became salt, and then God took pity and gave you a third, and over again you launched through your many reprieves and mistakes, one moment motionless and the next gangly, your soft limbs wheeling and your body staggering into the dirt, and then stiff as a tree trunk again with an aura of dust, and then windmilling down the road as fire rains down behind you, and there has never been a woman as cartoonish as you, animal to mineral and back again. Thank you. And I guess now we're going to do questions.
Thank you both. We have mics here at the front of the hall. If anyone has a question, we'll take a few questions before the book signing. Please come to the mic so everyone can hear. I think there was a hand raised back there, maybe not.
Hi. Hello. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed both your readings. It was an extremely wonderful evening. I was curious, you addressed the reader, but you said you didn't want to talk about why you used the second person. So my question is going against what you said you didn't want to talk about. I'm asking you to talk about that, but I'm just really curious about, why at that point you literally said reader instead of you.
Yeah, it was sort of a joke just because people have said, did you know you were reading in second person? And I was like, yes, I'm aware of the person of my own. Yes, I'm aware. Which is why I joke, don't ask me why. But no, actually, so the you in this book, I do address the reader in this book, and I usually say reader, but the you in this book is actually not the reader, it's me. It's like an old version of myself. So yeah, the first draft of this book, the one that I sold, Grey Wolf, was entirely in second person, and God bless Ethan, who was like, so it's not that you can't have a memoir in second person, but I want to make sure that you're being very purposeful about it. And I was like, cool, well, come back to me in like a year and a half, I'm done touring this other book, and we'll like talk about it. And when I went and sat down to actually I sat down like, to work on this book, and I was like, oh, I can just put it in first person, there's no reason for it to be in second. Because I'd sort of written it in second kind of by accident, like I didn't really realize I was doing it, and then I did it, and I was like, that's interesting. I'm gonna unpack that in therapy this week, and it was weird because when I tried to put it into first person, the text was really resisting me. Like it didn't sound right when I was reading it out loud, and I think I realized that there's something about the second person about addressing that self, that version of myself that I can't. Like there's a part of the book that I didn't read out loud about time travel and about this thing called Nabokov's self-consistency principle in time travel, which is this idea that like if you could travel back in time, you wouldn't be able to change or alter events of the past because they've already happened, and it's like just impossible. Like the things have already happened. And so like writing this book was a lot about like going back to this former self who like couldn't really hear me and like pounding on the glass, and she's just like doing her dishes or whatever, and I'm like, hey, like I've got things to say to you, but I can't access you. Like I can only sort of look at you and write about you. So yeah, so so there's a first person voice in this book that's like the more essayistic pieces, the sort of the present day pieces, that's like the I, and then the you is like this sort of perpetual present tense, perpetual second person, and is just sort of spinning her wheels eternally in the past.
I'd like to ask something related to that. Both books are so original in terms of voice and form. Would you both say something about finding and feeling confident in the voice and the forms that you were going to choose to tell these stories in?
No, I should have said it's wonderful to be here tonight with Carmen. But I think there's an exploration across the work. So there are multiple forms that are residing in the covers of the book, and I think that that has everything to do with the requirements of story and figuring out what those requirements are, and then following the dictates of that. So, and certainly you do that so wonderfully in your work, so.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the form of the book, like the sort of the using the genre elements as like sort of modes of interrogation, was actually the thing I needed for the book to like unlock the content of the book. I mean, I needed it, like, because I wrote a lot of stuff that wasn't very good, and it wasn't until I figured out that I needed these like modes that I actually managed to make it. Like the whole thing kind of just came together in this way that was really meaningful and interesting, and it felt like it had a necessary sort of levity and like buoyancy to it that it didn't have in a more straightforward way. So yeah, so for me the form was just like a necessary part of the process, and once I identified it, then I was able to sort of create the book in a more like sort of purposeful and meaningful way.
Would you tell us how you found it? Did you try one and think, oh, that works? Or look back and say, oh, I've done a few of them, let me keep going?
I was actually teaching a summer workshop in Iowa City. I had left, I didn't live there anymore, but I was back teaching high school nerd writer camp. And so I was talking about genre a lot with my students, because that's like what I'm really interested in, like what we were talking about almost every single day. And so it was just it was like in my mind, it was on the brain. And then I was walking around Iowa City, and I had a lot of downtime, and I was thinking about haunted houses, which is also a thing that I've been very interested in the last like 5 years or so. And I was sort of like, I wonder if that's like a mode I could use, or like an avenue or an angle or way to think about it. And then I was like, well, why haunted houses? Why not like, generation ship, in science fiction, or why not, epic fantasy or whatever. And then I was like, what about all of them? And then by the time I had left Iowa City a few weeks later, I had like a notebook full of way more ideas than are actually in that. This book has 144 distinct pieces, and I wrote down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things in this notebook, like ideas that so, and it felt like really almost inevitable, once I did that, I was like, oh, that's what I have to do, that's like the thing I have to do, so.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I have one question, but there's not a huge line, so I'm actually going to ask two. The fake question is, where did you get that amazing blazer?
Oh. They should pay me to advertise for them, but it's ModCloth. I buy like a lot of blazers from ModCloth.
That's valid. Okay. My actual question is, I'm wondering like, who's writing right now you two are enjoying and like would recommend?
So, because I've been in like nonfiction mode for a while, the two books that I've read that are one is out and one is coming out very soon. There's this really incredible memoir by Janine Vasco called "Things We Didn't Talk About When I Was a Girl" that's coming. I think that one's already out, or I think it's out this month. And that is a memoir. I feel like also like you would like really like it. Like when I was reading it, I was thinking like I feel like this feels like almost like a companion book. Like it felt like it was like very much in conjunction with my own book. And it's this really gorgeous sort of experimental memoir about where she interviews her own rapist. It's very intense, obviously, but it's really good and really beautiful and devastating and very interesting. There's like transcripts of these conversations, and it's really fascinating. And then the other one is another sort of more experimental sort of memoir that's coming out in the spring, I think also from 10 House Books, actually, by Jen Chaplin called My Autobiographies of Carson McCullers, which is her sort of using the archive of like Carson McCullers' work as like a lens to examine like her own queer identity. And it's gorgeous and really special and really like new and different. It feels really like just like a whole new thing. So those are two writers whose work like I've been reading like this year that have also been like, I feel like have been helpful for me to even think about how to like talk about my own book, you know?
When you asked that question, I just like totally drew a blank because you fear that question because there's so many wonderful, wonderful books that you hate to just name two. So I really like Svetlana Alexievich's book Chernobyl, The Voices of Chernobyl, which is an exquisite, in terms of the way it's using nonfiction, but so very storied. I'm reading lots of just really wonderful poets, so if I could just maybe name like 5 people or something like that. So whatever I read recently, I've read Felon, which is really great. I've read Look. I've read All That Beauty, DM Brands, The Blue Clerk. So
Cool. Thank you.
Hello again. My name is Anthony Thomas, representing Westside High School. I see that Ms. Hartman and Ms. McAdoo has a lot in common. What I noticed is that you took your writing and expressed sexuality, whether it was in a form of domination or internal insecurity. What made you to take that road within writing?
Well, we're pleased you asked, because one of the things we were thinking of is that high school students were reading our books and there's so much sexuality in them. So we were wondering.
We were like, have they read those books yet?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that for Wayward Lives, sexuality and intimate life was so important because it's a terrain in which people are really trying to explore what it means to be free, what it means to be embodied in a way that doesn't feel fundamentally like you're the kind of possession of someone else, and to imagine a pleasure that's possible in embodiment, not through a male gaze or a white gaze, right? And I think one of the ways I thought about that in the book was partly the ecstasy as this dispossessive experience. So it's not that you move from being owned by one person to self-ownership as much as it's a kind of a release from that relationship to the body. And it seemed very important to talk about sensuality and embodiment as a way of redressing, the violence of a world that's against you. So in an anti-Black sexist world, how does a young Black woman or a Black girl come to love herself? So that's why it was important for me.
Yeah. Also, I mean, writing about sex and sexuality is sort of part of my project. So I was talking to you guys earlier about like how you figure out kind of what you want to say and how you want to say it. And I was like, a thing I want to say is that like sex can be great. Queer sex is an art form, and I want to write about it in the way that it deserves to be written about. And you know, when I've read work about sex, you know, I feel like women, especially queer women, do not get a lot of space to talk about sex explicitly in literature. And that really bugged me. Like, it bugged me that when I was like, I want to read like sex writing in literary fiction, like the examples that were being handed to me were like Philip Roth, and like that's fine, but also like I was like, there's like limits to what that can do, you know, there's like limits to what that does for me. And so I'm just like interested in like other stuff, and I'm interested in thinking about it sort of, you know. And I actually did I had a workshop. I did a master class once with this writer, Alan Gurganis, and he said this really beautiful thing that I love, which I've never forgotten, which is you should give your characters a role in the hay. They work hard, they deserve it. And I was like, that's so beautiful. That's like a really beautiful idea. And like, you know, if you think about sex as this like thing, this sort of act of like generosity and beauty, and also like a thing, like a deepening of characterization, and like a space for, you know, a lot of like sort of stuff like so to happen on the page. And that especially as joy, like not just sex that's like bad, which also can be interesting and funny and useful in its own way, but like, you know, that can just be like something that's really like you can sort of give to the reader, and you can give that to the characters and give it to yourself. And that just really interests me. I mean, it's certainly weirder to write about it with nonfiction when it's like me. I don't know if I have anything to say about that. It's a little more intense and a little different, but I do like it. I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth committing to the page.
Thank you, ladies.
Hello, thank you both for such a, wonderful time to share your art. I had a particular question for Dr. Hartman, and so I'm gonna have to reference my phone. Okay. But I'm curious just to think both across Scenes of Subjection and also this book that you've given, Wayward Lives, in terms of languages and choices. So we talked a little bit in terms of the books that you're interested in terms of now, but I'm curious about what books you return to when you're experiencing a writer's block. What's the kind of like, set of texts that maybe you find help craft that new language that you're giving us so generously? And then second, I have a question about in terms of methodology, in terms of the sources that you use, and how you pick and choose which ways to marshal that evidence to then generate this more beautiful tableau where you kind of take a singular moment and expand it to these kinds of, imaginative questions that allow us to then think about these questions that the subject might also have. Thank you.
Yeah. Those were two great, hard questions. You know, I tend to return to things I love that inspire me. So one thing that is a text, that I really love is Morrison's A Mercy, and partly because it's an intellectual history of the founding of this republic, but in the form of a novel. So the way she's able to handle the complexity of an idea in narrative form, I realize that many of the novels that I actually like have no dialogue in them whatsoever. And I think that it's partly because I'm always thinking about, how do you translate certain thoughts, certain kind of philosophical framings of the world, but in a way that they travel. Another novel that's just really one of my favorites is Michael Ondaatje's Coming Through Slaughter. And there's, again, just the archival work, the poetic density, and speaking of sex, I think he writes so, just so incredibly about what it means to be in flesh in that book. And you also asked me this notion about how do I marshal sources or evidence, and I should also say that music is another important text, and often there'll just be a song line from something that an album that came out, some music that came out this year, but it's like so perfectly encapsulates something that happened 100 years ago that I'll just borrow it. And I feel like there are a lot of other voices that are inside my head, and trying to have all of that speak on the page, because so much of my work is about archival silence and lack and dearth, that often in the work I will choose to sit with one moment, and it's often a moment in which I have like actually no idea what happens. It's not as if the archival record about Maddie Jackson had an explicit description of what happened in the room between her and Herman Hawkins, right? But it was such a turning point for her, and so much was unleashed there that then was a moment that I had to kind of sit with and dilate to really figure out, what is the character of this revolution of intimate life that's happening in the city. So often interrogatives is a way that I'll do that, and really just working with the body as a resource for story building too.
Thank you both so much for your readings tonight and your contributions more generally. I have a question about tracking and tracing in terms of producing the works that you write. You both work with so much, whether it's through different memories and experiences or through a plethora of archival sources, criminal records, social work notes, and repositories. I'm wondering how you, manage all of that content and then work through them in order to piece together the beautiful texts and books and other writings that you produce.
Oh, God. So as I was writing this book, I kept thinking of that scene in Contact, that movie Contact with Jodie Foster, where she's like, says they should have sent a poet. And I was writing this, and I was like, they should have sent a historian or an academic, because I'm neither. And I actually felt very overwhelmed by the task of trying to marshal sources, because that was just not a thing that I sort of have any training in or any kind of, so I was sort of teaching myself. My desk, and they were just, at some point they were like, we need to check all your quotes. And I was like, oh no. I was sure, I'll get back to you with 5 days. And it was just I just had to dig through these mountains of books and piles of paper on my desk, and go through my computer and try to trace my own research process. It was very messy. I do not recommend the system that I used, which is no system at all. I used Scrivener just to keep notes, but even that did not keep me very organized. So don't do what I did. I don't know.
How do you keep it all, taking really, really detailed notes, but I think that there's something also about what you're describing as the mess, which is the space of creativity. It's because where parts that don't belong together actually come together. And sometimes misremembering quotes is also really good, because you're responding to a source, or you misremember something in a way that changes it. I think I do. I make these concept maps, and so how do I map out a book project as a way of trying to hold those pieces together? But it's an unwieldy beast, and things slip through and you forget and all of that. So it's there's organization, there's archival work, there's notes about the notes, and then there's the creative mess of it too.
Thank you.
Maybe this will be the last one.
Hello. I kind of have a two-part question. It's basically, in your book, you guys both have powerful titles, and I was just wondering, how did you, after writing your book, how did you compact it to show that this was your message and this is what I wanted to go across? And then specifically for Saidiya, how did the stories that you chose, how did you know that this would be perfect to get my point across, so that people know what I'm trying to say and what the impact I want you to feel out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, there was, the poetry and possibility that resides in waywardness, but there was a state discourse and practice that had already contained that as crime, as pathology, or, the poverty of the ghetto, the slum photos, all of that. So for me, it was important to underscore the beauty that's a part of this experiment in trying to live. And it was a space that was so already familiar, so overly familiar through its identification as a problem, right? Through poverty, through all the social descriptors, that the beautiful experiment of it was something that I had to underscore. And in terms of, I read, there was like 75 case files about, young women that I encountered, but they had to be really, really wayward for me to engage them. So if it was just like a good girl who had gone wrong, then I was like, no. So there had to be like a deep investment in a certain practice of being errant to make clear, to make clear the stakes of this project, to want to live differently than a way that had been dictated by the world.
Yeah, so I guess what made me decide that this was sort of what I had to do, like I'm a big believer in writing the books that you wish you saw but you don't. And, I feel like my first book was that as well. Like I was like, this is the kind of fiction that I want to be reading, like a queer Shirley Jackson, Angela Carter, Nicholson Baker hybrid, and I guess I have to write it myself. And then I got to do it, and it was really exciting. And with this book, I was like, I really want to talk about this space that the space that exists, which is like, when I went looking for narratives about intimate partner violence and queer relationships, I found very, very little, almost nothing, in terms of like memoirs or creative nonfiction. And I was like, well, that seems like a big old, that like a space that needs filling. And I decided that had to be like a project I wanted to work on. And the title, I don't know, the title was kind of it had a different title for a long time that I hated, because it was called House in Indiana. Everybody would ask me if I was from Indiana, and they'd be like, my cousin's from Indiana, I'm from Indiana, I love Indiana, I drove through Indiana one time. I have a lot of feelings about Indiana, and I was like, I have no feelings about Indiana as a state. Like, please do not ask me one more time about the state of Indiana. And so I then just decided to change the title so no one would ask me that question ever again. And so I was thinking a lot about like house. I read that piece about house idioms, and I was thinking about like houses, house metaphors, and I was thinking about the idea of a dream house, which is like, people say like, oh, it's my dream house. It's like, the place I've always wanted to be. Also, there's like a Barbie show or like movie that anyway, that's which I've discovered now getting like Google alerts, and I've discovered that there's a Barbie show. But also the idea of like dreaming, and the idea of that sort of liminal space, and a space, of fantasy, which is also like part of the book, is like discussing sort of the way that we think about gay relationships as sort of like a fantasy, like a beautiful fantasy or like a utopia. So the title just like worked on a bunch of different levels that I thought was really interesting, and then that was it. That was the title.
Thank you.
Thank you.